Hi, this is Mary Tobin again, and I'm sitting here with my colleague Renee Fazzari from the General Service Foundation.
Hi, nice to be here.
So, Renee, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about this project that we did together, Aligning for Impact, and could you just tell us a little bit about how we got started and what made us decide to do this?
So, let's see, a little over a year ago, we were meeting with a small group of funders, you and I, and 8 other people, and kind of feeling like there were challenges in our sector of civic engagement funding, challenges in the field that just were not really being addressed, but we didn't kind of know what exactly to do about it. And, in particular, that it felt like there was an asymmetry of information between national funders and state funders, and feeling like there wasn't an ability for everybody to see sort of the whole system at once and to understand how most effectively to fund the work that we wanted to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
So,
sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
How did we come up with that collective understanding about the asymmetry of information?
Mm-hmm. You facilitated a pretty good meeting. Do you want to say anything about that? It was 10 close funder colleagues that we were already in relationship with, kind of getting into a room and saying oh, I'm seeing that problem too. Are you seeing that problem? Trying to kind of drill down together, and we use an action learning framework to get there, right?
Yeah, I think we wanted to spend more time than just what we usually would have, which would be in the hallway of a conference or a 2-hour meeting. So we took an extra day after a conference that we were all going to be at to really collectively think through, what is this problem? Can we come up with one sentence or one definition of what we're all seeing, so that we could easily describe it to our colleagues in the field and move on from there to figure out how we would address potential solutions.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So then midway through, about March, I kind of came up with the idea that, okay, if the problem is we don't have enough information, what we need is a map. And so if we could have a map of all of the different funding and where it's going, people would just be all of a sudden, their eyes would open and everything would be illuminated and we could solve some of these problems, right? Or at least it would be a great way to start discussion. And that's when I found Group Haya and started working with Eugene and Rebecca in particular. And they both said, maybe what you need is not a map. Maybe what you need is a process by which you could tap the collective wisdom of the group of people that you work with. That's when we kind of launched in, and I don't want to be redundant. Have you already talked about kind of the steps we took?
We have talked a lot about a lot of the different parts of the process, so I think you can jump in and just go from there.
So we started off just kind of with a pretty broad, so should I go into it a little bit more deeply?
We talked about the conference,
mm-hmm.
and we are also thinking about how we were thinking about moving forward and inviting people into the next step. So I would just talk from there.
Okay. I think that the genius of the first kind of work we did was to invite everybody and make it really open and allow anybody from our system to kind of be a part of our process. And then our process was to actually, work through Adobe Connect calls, where we connected with each other virtually for 6 different calls, and then got together in a retreat. And all the way along, I felt like there was just so much different learning about how to actually be in a network and be in communication with each other, and really kind of blew up some of my constructs about how we can do this work and how long it takes and how to build relationships.
Great. And can you talk a little bit more about what were some of the specific questions that we all tackled together on these calls and in the retreat, and what were the things that we were exploring together as our community of civic engagement funders?
Sure. So we started off just actually trying to define what is civic engagement. So even the most basic things that we talk about all the time, right? We don't have a common shared definition of it. So trying to actually map out the different components and the way that each person comes to this work differently was actually very enlightening just to begin. And then we started to kind of grab a little bit of information from the field about what are some of the problems we're seeing, what are we facing in this sector, and how can we, and basically just kind of expanding the sense of the problem. I don't know, do you have specific things you remember of like what our problem analysis was?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what we learned, I learned that we all have very different definitions of what we think the problems are, and yet there were very similar underlying values about both the vision that we set out in our larger group process, and then when we started to dissect, okay, what is the problem, what are the definitions, I learned that we often think we're talking in code for certain words, or we think we say one thing as a program officer, but one thing as an individual in terms of how we think about the field and the work. And so we're able to take the time to unpack a lot of those perceived differences and come together for that collective sense making and shared analysis and realize, okay, actually, we're not all talking about different things, but we're talking about different parts of the elephant. And that was definitely one of the visual images that made it into some of the storyboards. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of those visual outputs that we were able to produce by working with Rebecca and the team at Grupaya.
Mm-hmm. Well, just quickly before getting to that, on your point, like I think that it also just became really clear that there's not a space for us to share information in any kind of real way. Like everybody is trying to attack the problem as they see it, but none of us have a full sense of the problem or of the challenges that face our sector and our field, because so we all kind of wind up taking off a little piece, trying to tinker with it here, and then by so doing, like creating even more complexity within the system. So actually, like having a broad sense of here's what we're facing, and this is the challenge we're looking at, I think was really illuminating for people, and people really just appreciated that. And then to answer your question, all the way through, one of the great things about working with Rebecca is that she was constantly documenting what we were doing. So as we would have a phone call with 15 to 20 people on it, she would be mapping responses to a question and ensuring that the responses we talked about in small groups on the Adobe Connect software would come back into a broader map. So we had these maps that were building on each other that were helping us see the depth of the conversation we had had already, which meant that when we got into a retreat space after the dialogue calls, we were able to sort of hit the ground running with a shared sense of where we were coming from. And then we could start kind of thinking about, well, what would be experimental sort of solution spaces around some of this stuff? And then that, all of those maps were turned into sort of a storybook that we could then share out with our broader network. So we were able to be actually much more transparent in this process than most of the things that usually happen in this network, because we were constantly documenting and we could actually hand people sort of the content results at the end.
Yeah, I think that's a really important takeaway is the documentation and the collective mapping. Participants really talked about the value of being able to see in real time what they were saying mapped along with what everybody else was saying, and how that was building on the conversation and the outputs that we were trying to seek. And also to your point of it, it's just not the culture of our network in our field to be sharing information in that way in real time, visually learning. And so I think that was really a new thing for us and something that worked well, and certainly something that we could also improve on. Are there any other things, like lessons learned, things that you feel like you personally learned from this process?
Absolutely. I honestly feel like I've kind of learned a whole different way of working. So, because it used to be for me that I would, and for us, right, like we both did this, that if you have a problem to solve, the best way to do it is to get a few of your friends in the room and then have an organizing strategy about how you're going to go, get the power players in line and try to make something happen. And I feel like the alternative proposal that's been presented to me that I still feel I have to continuously practice to remind myself that it's a good idea is that actually you can have everybody in the space, or you can invite everybody into the space, and there can be a very diverse number of perspectives that then can kind of filter up into building the collective wisdom you seek, without having to kind of heavy-handedly or directively say, like, this is who we're going to put in the room and this is how it's going to work. So, I mean, that's a huge one for me. How about for you?
I think it was just, having a process that made it okay to say the things that were hard to say, and that was definitely a value that we wanted to carry into this process. And so for me, it was very rewarding to be in healthier spaces of conflict with people. I think we got really far in terms of being able to see where our points of disagreement were, but also trust each other enough and really be committed enough to the values and the vision of what we were trying to do that we could go there. And I think I also just learned to be more comfortable in spaces of not knowing, and really being okay with an emergent design and an emergent process where we weren't even sure what the outcomes were necessarily going to be.
Right.
And that we were testing like phase one of a hypothesis where we still don't know what the answers are. We laid a lot of the groundwork. And so maybe, building off of that, if you could talk a little bit about what are some of the next steps for this work.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that the outcomes are very unclear still, right? And we still are having to trust that the principles that we started this with are actually going to take us towards an outcome that is what we want to see, because it's way longer than what it could have been if we would have tried the old way, but I don't think the old way would have actually accomplished very much, right? So I think that right now we're in a place where we're kind of recontracting, figuring out what's next. We've heard from the community that was engaged in the first phase of the experiment. They really want to continue to be engaged. So, we'll probably have a little fall off, but most of the people will come back. We want to have a series of phone call, Adobe Connect dialogue calls again, but not as frequent, so to take a little bit of the pressure off of the team that's kind of designing this process. And we want to get more feedback from the field. So we did a lot of conversation amongst the funders, but we didn't have very many opportunities to really delve in and find out, like, what does the field need? Where does the field think we should go with all this? So we want to kind of intersperse that throughout the calls this year, and then we'll get together again this December and see kind of where we're at, see what's been produced, how we want to continue this. Do you want to talk about the experiment part of this or anything, or any other parts of the kind of ongoing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we also want to make sure we're doing some action learning, so learning by doing, and funders want to feel like they're not just talking to talk. And so we want to have a bounded, concrete experiment built into the ongoing Adobe Connect calls as well, and that's something that we would contract with Rebecca to hold that space for us, so that we feel like we have a start time and end time, we tried some things out, and we're ultimately adding value on big questions in our field. And we've tossed around things like the importance of leadership development, the importance of how do we measure impact in a civic engagement space, and things like that. And so now that we've built shared understanding and collective thinking about our sense of what vision is, goal, the sense of the problem, now we have a space where we can really try out some solution ideas with a concrete experiment. So,
what are your hopes? What are your hopes for where we land?
I hope that this is a transformative experience for the field. I think it is about people and relationships, and how we sort of take our own personal responsibility for trying to change the way we do our work, and ultimately that can have networked impacts. And I think my hope is that we, more authentically are able to partner with the grant makers or the field practitioners, in addition to the grant makers that we all are in relationship with. And yourself?
I mean, I feel like that we've done so much just to build relationships, and I've learned so much about how important a relational network is to doing anything. I kind of knew that, but I don't think I've ever invested the time in doing that. I hope that the experiment we're doing in the smaller setting, in this work group, will actually become the norm in our larger network, that it will be more about relationship building and network building and transparently sharing information and data, rather than kind of what a usual foundation affinity group is, which is often just kind of hearing from grantees, which is also great and important, but there's so much more that we can do together if we actually are engaged at a strategic level. So I'm hoping that, there's kind of the appreciation and holding of the importance of those relationships, long-term relationship building over time in the network.
Thanks.